The night that ruined my life did not arrive with thunder or screams. It came softly, wearing perfume and a borrowed smile, slipping into my youth like a thief who knew exactly where I kept my heart. I was 19 then, still thin as a reed, still believing the world was fair if you behaved well. I had just finished my shift at the dress shop, my fingers aching from pins and hems, when I walked home under a sky the color of bruised peaches. Mama always said evenings like that were warnings, but I didn't know yet how to listen. I only knew I felt restless, as if something inside me was pacing, waiting to be called forward. His name was Daniel. Even now, writing it feels like pressing on an old scar, smooth on the surface, burning underneath. He had the kind of kindness that made you feel chosen, the kind that leaned close and spoke softly so you believed the words were meant only for you. He was older, already steady in the world, already sure of himself. When he looked at me, I felt taller somehow, less like a girl waiting her turn. That night, he said he just wanted to talk, said he could see I was lonely, said I deserved to feel wanted. I wish I could tell you I resisted. I wish I could say I walked away with my dignity tucked neatly under my arm. But youth is a dangerous thing. It convinces you that one night can be erased, that consequences belong to other people. I followed him into the rented room above the bakery, the smell of sugar and yeast still warm in the air. I remember the window was open, curtains breathing in and out like lungs. I remember my heart beating so loudly I was sure the neighbors could hear. When it was over, he kissed my forehead like he was blessing me, like he was doing me a kindness. Then he told me we must never speak of it again. Not for his sake, he said, but for mine. People wouldn't understand a girl like me. People were cruel. I nodded. I always nodded back then. By morning, he was gone, and by the following week, I knew something inside me had changed forever. At first, I told myself it was nerves. I had always been irregular, Mama said. But weeks passed, then another month, and the fear grew teeth. I counted days the way prisoners mark walls. When the truth finally settled into my bones, it didn't scream. It sat quietly, heavy as a stone. I was pregnant. I didn't cry at first. I just stared at myself in the mirror, touching my stomach like it belonged to someone else. I remember thinking how strange it was that something so small could undo an entire life. In those days, there was no room for mistakes, especially not for girls. One wrong step and you were branded, whispered about, pitied in that sharp, poisonous way. I thought of Daniel, of course. I even walked past his workplace once, my legs trembling so badly I had to lean against a wall. But when I saw him laughing with another woman, her hand resting comfortably on his arm, I understood something cold and final. That night had been nothing to him. A moment, a distraction. To me, it was a sentence. Mama figured it out before I told her. Mothers always do. She sat at the kitchen table one evening, hands folded, eyes fixed on the wood, as if it might speak for her. When she finally looked up, there was no anger there. Just disappointment so deep it felt like grief. "We'll handle it," she said, "but no one can know." That became the rule of my life. I was sent away to my aunt's farm 2 towns over, told the neighbors I was helping with the harvest. I wore loose dresses and learned how to move carefully, how to breathe shallow so no one would notice. At night, I lay awake listening to crickets and wondered how something growing inside me could feel so much like a punishment. When the baby came, there was no celebration, no naming ceremony, just pain and silence and my aunt's tight mouth. I wasn't allowed to hold her for long. A girl, they said, a healthy one. I counted her fingers, her tiny clenched fists, her warm breath against my skin. She smelled like milk and endings. They took her away before dawn. I never even got to name her. Mama said it was for the best. She said a young woman with a future couldn't be tied down by shame. She said forgetting would come with time. I nodded, because that's what I had learned to do. But forgetting is a lie people tell themselves to survive. I came home thinner, quieter. People commented on how mature I seemed. They didn't know maturity was just grief taught to sit still. I took a job at the library, married a decent man named Henry 2 years later. He was gentle and predictable and never asked too many questions. When he touched me, I stared at the ceiling and counted breaths. Love, I learned, could be endured. We had no children. Everyone said it was fate or God's will. Henry accepted it with a sad shrug. I accepted it like a debt I was still paying. Years passed, then decades. The world changed. Televisions appeared, skirts shortened, women spoke louder. But inside me, time stayed frozen in that rented room above the bakery. Every birthday felt like a quiet reckoning. Somewhere, my daughter was aging alongside me, a shadow walking parallel to my life. Sometimes I dreamed of her. In my dreams, she always stood just out of reach, her face blurred, her eyes questioning. I would wake with my heart racing, my mouth full of apologies I had never spoken aloud. I told no one. Not my husband, not my friends, not even God, though I tried. Secrets like that don't sit still. They burrow. They shape the choices you make, the silences you keep, the way you flinch when someone asks too much. By the time Henry died, I was already an old woman, my body stiff, my hands spotted like fallen leaves. People said I had lived a quiet, respectable life. They had no idea how loud the past still was. I thought the story ended there. I thought the punishment was complete. I was wrong, because the truth has a way of waiting. And after 60 years of silence, it finally came back to knock on my door. The knock came on a Tuesday, ordinary as dust, the kind of day that never warns you it's about to reopen a life you buried alive. I had just boiled water for tea. The kettle was still screaming when the sound reached me, 3 soft raps, hesitant, almost apologetic. I remember being irritated at first. People rarely came anymore. Most of my friends were already in the ground, and the younger ones had lives too busy to include an old woman who moved slowly and spoke carefully. When I opened the door, the world tilted. She stood there holding a manila envelope, her coat buttoned wrong, her hair pulled back too tightly like she was bracing herself. She was maybe in her early 60s. My age, give or take, but her eyes were the thing that stopped my breath. They were my eyes, not exactly, but close enough to feel like a mirror warped by time. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking, like she was counting my breaths. "My name is Margaret," she said. "I'm sorry to bother you. I think you might be my mother." The kettle screamed itself dry behind me. I don't remember inviting her in, but suddenly she was sitting at my small kitchen table, hands folded the same way Mama used to fold hers when bad news was coming. The envelope lay between us like a weapon neither of us dared touch. My heart was pounding so hard I worried it might simply give up and end the conversation for me. I denied it first. That's what people do when the truth is too big to swallow. I told her she must be mistaken, that lots of women had babies back then, that records were unreliable. She listened patiently, nodding, letting me exhaust myself on lies I had rehearsed for 60 years. Then she opened the envelope. Inside were copies of birth records, adoption papers, names crossed out and rewritten. My name, my aunt's name, dates only someone inside the story could know. And at the bottom, in handwriting I recognized instantly, was Mama's signature. I felt something inside me collapse. Not break, collapse. Like a house that had been standing on borrowed beams for decades. "I didn't come to accuse you," Margaret said quietly. "I just needed to see you. To know." Know what? I wanted to ask. That I had loved her? That I had hated myself every day for letting her go? That my entire life had been built around surviving the absence of her? Instead, I stared at her hands. She had my hands too, long fingers, prominent knuckles, nails cut short, practical hands, survivor's hands. She told me her story then, about growing up in a good home, loving parents, no shortage of food or warmth. About always feeling like something was missing but not knowing what shape it took. About finding the adoption papers after her adoptive mother died, tucked inside a cookbook like a confession. "I didn't hate you," she said quickly, as if reading my thoughts. "I just wondered. All my life, why?" That word, why, cut deeper than any accusation could have. I told her everything, not neatly, not bravely. It spilled out of me in fragments, sobs breaking through sentences, my hands shaking so badly I had to sit on them. I told her about Daniel without saying his name at first, about the bakery room, about Mama's eyes at the kitchen table, about the farm, about the morning they took her away before the sun came up. Margaret cried then, not loudly, just tears sliding down her face, like something finally being allowed to fall. "I looked for you for years," I whispered. "But they told me not to. They said it would only cause harm." She nodded. "They told me the same thing that my birth mother wanted to forget." That sentence landed like a slap. Forget? As if forgetting were ever an option. She stayed for hours. We drank cold tea. We studied each other's faces like maps, tracing similarities, measuring distances. It was beautiful and unbearable all at once. Every laugh felt stolen. Every moment felt like borrowed time. Before she left, she asked one question I had feared my entire life. "Do you know who my father was?" I hesitated. 60 years of silence pressed against my teeth. I could still protect him, still shield the past, still pretend some debts didn't need collecting. But then I looked at her, my daughter, my ghost made flesh, and I realized something sharp and clear. The betrayal hadn't ended that night. It had been renewed every day I stayed silent. I told her his name, Daniel. The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. She gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening, her breath turning shallow. "That's not possible," she whispered. But it was, because Daniel hadn't vanished after that night. He had stayed, he had built a life, and he had been closer to both of us than I ever knew. When she finally explained why Daniel's name shook her, the room seemed to shrink, like the walls were leaning in to listen. "He raised me," she said. I laughed then. A thin, broken sound that didn't belong to humor. I thought she must be confused, must mean a different Daniel. A coincidence. But she reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph so worn the edges had gone soft. A man stood in it with one arm around a smiling woman, the other resting on the shoulder of a young girl missing her two front teeth. I recognized him instantly. Older, yes. Hair thinner. Lines around the mouth that hadn't been there when he leaned close to me in that bakery room. But it was him. The same eyes, the same crooked confidence. Daniel. "He married my adoptive mother when I was 5, Margaret said. He was kind. Strict sometimes, but kind. He used to read to me at night, fixed my bike, walked me down the aisle when I got married. I felt sick. Truly sick, like my body was rejecting the truth outright. I had lived my whole life believing Daniel escaped consequences, that he walked free while I paid the price. And now I was learning he had lived inside my punishment, that he had held my daughter's hand, brushed her hair, watched her grow, things I had imagined in dreams but never dared hope for. "He knew," I said. It wasn't a question. Margaret swallowed. "I don't think so. Not at first. My mother told me she never told him about my adoption. She said it was none of his business." The room filled with a silence so loud it felt like noise. My heart pounded with a rage I had never allowed myself to feel. Daniel had been spared not just responsibility, but truth. And in that ignorance, he had been given everything I lost. "Did he ever say anything?" I asked. "About me?" She shook her head slowly. "Only once. When I was a teenager, I asked him why he never had children of his own before marrying my mother. He said he'd made a mistake once, long ago, and that it cost someone dearly." I closed my eyes. That was his confession. That was all he ever allowed himself. Margaret stayed the night. Neither of us wanted to let the day end, afraid that if it did, we might wake and discover it had all been a cruel dream. I gave her my bed and slept on the sofa, staring at the ceiling the way I had learned to do so many years ago. Sleep didn't come easily. Memories rose uninvited, one after another. Daniel's voice, Mama's hands, the baby's breath against my skin. And now, layered over everything, a new image. Daniel teaching my daughter how to ride a bike, running behind her with his hands outstretched, ready to catch her if she fell. In the morning, Margaret asked if I would come with her to the cemetery. "He's buried there," she said gently. "Daniel." I hadn't known he was dead. The news landed softly, like ash. I felt no relief, no satisfaction, just a strange emptiness, as if something I'd been bracing for all my life had slipped past me unnoticed. At his grave, Margaret stood straight, composed. I stood behind her, my legs weak, my hands clasped tightly in front of me like a penitent. His name was carved in stone, dates beneath it, a respectable life summarized in a few clean lines. I waited for anger to rise, for words to form, for something dramatic to happen. Nothing did. All I felt was tired. I don't know what to do with this, Margaret said quietly. Knowing he was my father, knowing you're my mother, it feels like my life has been rewritten. I wanted to tell her that life does that sometimes, that it rewrites you without asking. Instead, I said the only honest thing left in me. You don't owe me anything, I said. Not forgiveness, not closeness, not time. She turned then and looked at me with those familiar eyes, full of questions and resolve. I didn't come looking for a ghost, she said. I came looking for the truth. And now that I have it, I don't want to lose you again. We tried after that. We truly did. Phone calls at first, then visits. Shared holidays that felt awkward and precious at the same time. We learned each other slowly, carefully, like handling something fragile. I learned she loved gardening. She learned I hated the smell of yeast because it reminded me of endings. But secrets don't disappear just because they're spoken. They change shape. One evening, years later, after Margaret had gone home, I found the manila envelope again. I hadn't opened it since that first day. This time, something inside compelled me to look closer, to read every line, every note in the margins, and that's when I saw it. A date, a signature, Daniel's. My hands began to shake, because buried inside those papers was proof that Daniel hadn't been as ignorant as we believed. He had known, he had always known, and he had chosen again and again to stay silent. The betrayal hadn't been one night. It had been a lifetime. I sat at the kitchen table long after the light outside faded, the papers spread before me like evidence at a trial that had waited 60 years to begin. My tea went untouched. My hands hovered, afraid to touch what they had already touched. Daniel's signature was unmistakable. It wasn't bold or dramatic, just his ordinary handwriting. The same careful slant I had seen once on a receipt he'd left behind in the bakery room. The date beside it was from years after Margaret's birth, years after he had married her adoptive mother, years after he had tucked my daughter into bed and kissed her forehead. Good night. He had signed a confidentiality agreement tied to the adoption. He had known. I pressed my palm flat against the paper as if it might burn me. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought this was it, that my heart, tired of carrying what my mouth never said, had finally had enough. All those years I had told myself a story, that Daniel had been careless, selfish, thoughtless, but ignorant. That ignorance had been the thin mercy I granted him in my mind, the one thing that made the world feel less cruel. Now that mercy was gone. He had known there was a girl somewhere whose life had been shaped by his silence. He had known the child he raised was not only adopted, but his by blood. And he had chosen comfort over truth, chosen peace over accountability, chosen every single day not to tell. I thought of all the nights I lay awake wondering if my daughter was warm, if she was safe, if she felt loved. All the holidays I spent smiling politely while my body ached with an absence no one could name. All the times I told myself I deserved it. And he had gone to bed every night knowing the truth and letting me rot with it. The rage that came then was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It settled into me like ice water, heavy and suffocating. I had been faithful to a silence that was never shared equally. I had protected a man who did not deserve it. The next morning I called Margaret. I told her to come over. I told her there was something we needed to talk about. My voice sounded calm, even to me. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes before something breaks. She arrived with worry written all over her face. I slid the papers across the table without a word and watched her read. Her brow furrowed, then smoothed, then tightened again as understanding crept in. He knew, she whispered. Yes, I said. He knew the whole time. She covered her mouth with her hand. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness at first, but from something sharper, betrayal finally finding its true shape. All those years, she said, all those talks about honesty, about doing the right thing. I watched her grieve a father she had already buried once. This time, it was worse. This time, the man she lost wasn't just dead, he was revealed. "I don't know how to hold this," she said. Neither did I. The truth changed everything between us. It brought us closer in one way, bound by shared injury, but it also opened a space neither of us knew how to cross. She had lived a full life believing she was chosen, wanted, rescued. Now she had to sit with the knowledge that her father had chosen himself instead. And I had to sit with something even harder. I had spent my life paying for one night of betrayal, but I had also been paying for a lie that wasn't mine alone. For weeks after that, I slept poorly. Memories rearranged themselves in my mind, scenes rewriting their meaning. Daniel's distance when I passed him in town years later. His careful avoidance of my eyes. His sudden move to another neighborhood after marrying Margaret's adoptive mother. I had mistaken guilt for forgetfulness. It had been strategy. One evening as I lay awake listening to the clock tick, it hit me with a clarity that made my breath hitch. My punishment had never been required. I had been punished because I agreed to it. That realization hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. I had built my identity around silence, around being the good girl who bore consequences quietly. I had confused endurance with virtue, and in doing so, I had allowed my entire life to be shaped by someone else's comfort. The next time Margaret came over, I told her something I had never said aloud before. "I don't regret you," I said, "not for a single second, but I regret the life I thought I deserved." She reached for my hand and held it tightly, like she was anchoring me to the present. "You didn't deserve that," she said firmly. "You never did." Those words should have come from my mother, or from Daniel, or from someone back when they might have changed the course of my life. But they came now, late and necessary, from the child I had lost and found again. I began to change after that, slowly, awkwardly, like learning to walk with a limb that had been asleep too long. I spoke more freely. I corrected people when they assumed things about my past. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. And then came the letter. It arrived addressed to Margaret, forwarded to my house by mistake. Inside was a legal notice from an estate lawyer. Daniel had left something behind. Documents he requested be opened only after both his wife and daughter were informed. There was more, a final confession. And reading it would force us to confront the last truth he had kept hidden, the one that would finally decide whether his silence had been cowardice, or something even worse. Margaret didn't want to open the letter at first. She held it like it might bite, turning it over in her hands again and again, her thumb rubbing the edge where the paper had already begun to soften. "He's dead," she said quietly. "Why does he still get to speak?" I understood that feeling too well. Daniel had spoken over my life for decades without saying a word. Silence can be louder than confession. But the letter was there. And secrets, once they start unraveling, don't stop just because you ask them nicely. We opened it together at my kitchen table, the same place where so many truths had finally found their voice. The lawyer's language was neat and clinical, each sentence measured, careful not to bruise. But tucked inside was a separate envelope, thinner, sealed by hand. Daniel's handwriting again. Familiar. Controlled. Margaret hesitated, then tore it open. The letter began with an apology. Of course it did. Most apologies do, especially the kind written when there's no one left to answer back. He wrote that he had lived with regret, that he had been weak, that he had told himself he was protecting everyone by staying silent. I felt nothing reading those lines. Words like regret and weakness had worn grooves into my life. They no longer impressed me. Then the letter shifted. He wrote about the night with me, not in detail, not with tenderness, but with ownership. He admitted he knew I had become pregnant. Admitted he knew my family sent me away. Admitted he could have intervened, claimed responsibility, changed everything. But I didn't, he wrote, because I was afraid. Margaret's hands were shaking now. He went on to explain how, years later, when he met her adoptive mother, he recognized her immediately. The same eyes, the same hands. He suspected the truth almost at once. He confirmed it quietly, through channels meant to erase women like me from the story. He married her mother anyway. I told myself I could make it right by being present, he wrote, by being a good father in all the ways that mattered. I told myself blood was less important than behavior. Margaret let out a broken sound then, something between a laugh and a sob. And yet, the letter continued, there is one truth I never spoke. Not even to myself. I leaned closer. My heart felt too big for my chest. He confessed that the night with me had not been a moment of weakness. It had been calculated. He knew I was young. He knew my position. He knew I wouldn't speak. And the final blow, the one that made the room go utterly silent, came in the last paragraph. He wrote that he had chosen me because I was safe to betray. Margaret dropped the letter. For a long time, neither of us moved. The clock ticked. A car passed outside. The world, indifferent as ever, went on. Something inside me finally broke then. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The version of myself that had carried shame like a cross for 60 years collapsed under the weight of the truth. What I had called a mistake, what I had framed as youthful foolishness, had been exploitation. I had not been reckless. I had been chosen. The grief that followed was unlike anything I had known. It wasn't sharp. It was vast. It swallowed every version of myself I had been since 19. The girl who nodded, the woman who endured, the widow who believed her life had simply turned out that way. Margaret moved first. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around me, holding me the way I had imagined holding her as a baby, the way I never got to. I buried my face against her shoulder and cried. Not the quiet, polite crying I had mastered, but the kind that shakes loose everything you've been bracing. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't know, I said over and over. I didn't know. But now I did, and knowing changed something fundamental. In the weeks that followed, we talked more honestly than ever before. About anger, about guilt, about how people excuse harm when it wears a familiar face. Margaret struggled with her memories of Daniel, trying to reconcile the father who tucked her in with the man who had destroyed my life by design. I loved him, she said once, voice raw, and now I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to erase the love, I told her, but you don't have to protect him either. As for me, something unexpected happened. The shame began to loosen its grip. For the first time, I spoke of my past without flinching. I told a neighbor, then a friend. Not with tears, not with excuses, just truth. Each time the world didn't end. No one turned away in disgust. Some even said the words I had waited a lifetime to hear. That wasn't your fault. At night, I slept better. The dreams of a faceless girl stopped. When I thought of Margaret as a child now, I could finally see her clearly. Loved, laughing, real. Not just a ghost shaped like regret. But there was still one question left hanging between us, heavy and unresolved. What do we do now? Margaret asked one evening. I looked at my hands, these old, steady hands that had survived everything, and realized the answer had been waiting longer than the question. We tell the truth, not for revenge, not for spectacle, but because silence had already stolen too much, and because my life, our lives, deserved to be known as more than a footnote to a man's comfort. There was only one part left to face, and it would be the hardest one yet. I used to believe that endings arrived like doors closing, solid, final, unmistakable. What I learned, standing at the edge of my own truth, is that endings are quieter. They come like a long breath finally released. We did not go public in the way people imagine when they hear that phrase. There was no headline, no courtroom drama, no spectacle to punish a dead man who could no longer feel it. What we did instead was smaller, braver, and far more terrifying. We spoke. Margaret began with her children. Grown now, with lives of their own, they sat around her dining table the way families do when something serious is coming. She told them who I was. She told them the truth about Daniel, not softened, not excused, just laid bare, like a wound finally uncovered so it could heal. They cried. They were angry. They asked questions that had no satisfying answers, but none of them turned away. One of them, her daughter, came to see me a week later and held my hands as if she were holding history itself. "I'm glad you're here," she said. No one had ever said that to the girl I used to be. I wrote a letter to my church, not naming names, not demanding anything, just telling my story. I wrote about silence, about how easily it masquerades as virtue. I wrote about how young women are taught to disappear quietly for the comfort of others. I signed my name at the bottom and did not apologize for a single word. Some people didn't know what to say afterward. Some avoided my eyes, but others, more than I expected, came forward with stories of their own. Different details, same ache. We sat together sometimes in the fellowship hall, old women with lined faces and trembling hands, finally speaking without whispering. I learned then that my story was never just mine. Margaret and I grew closer in ways that felt almost miraculous for something born of such pain. We didn't pretend we had lost nothing. We grieved the years that could never be recovered, the birthdays missed, the scraped knees I didn't kiss, the bedtime stories I didn't read. But we also built something new, slowly, honestly. We gardened together in my small backyard. I taught her the names of flowers her hands already knew how to care for. She told me stories about her childhood, some happy, some now complicated by truth. We let those stories exist side by side, refusing to flatten them into something simpler. One afternoon, while we sat in the sun, she asked me something I hadn't expected. "Do you forgive him?" she asked. I thought about it for a long time. Forgiveness, I had learned, is not a favor you do for the person who hurt you. It's a boundary you draw around your own life. "I don't carry him anymore," I said finally. "If that's forgiveness, then yes." She nodded, and we let the conversation end there. As for me, something strange and beautiful happened in the final years of my life. I began to feel whole, not young, never young again, but complete in a way I had never been before. The shame that once bent my back straightened itself out. I laughed louder. I took up space. When people asked about my life, I told the truth. Not all of it, not always, but enough that I no longer felt like a shadow explaining herself. On my 82nd birthday, Margaret gave me a small wrapped box. Inside was a necklace, delicate and simple, with a single pendant engraved with a name. The name I had never been allowed to give her. "Your name," she said softly, "the one you would have chosen." I cried then, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. That night, lying in bed, I thought back to that 19-year-old girl walking home under a sky the color of bruised peaches. I wanted to reach back through time and take her hand, to tell her that the betrayal would not be the end of her story, that silence would not win forever, that one day she would be believed. I spent my life paying for one night of betrayal no one ever knew about. But that isn't how my life ended. It ended with truth spoken aloud, with my daughter's hand in mine, with shame finally laid down, with a story reclaimed. And if there is one thing I want anyone who hears this to understand, it is this: what was done to you in silence does not define you. The truth, when you are finally ready to speak it, does. There is one last thing I never told Margaret, not because it was a secret, but because some truths don't need witnesses to be real. Sometimes, in the quiet of early morning, when the house is still and the light creeps gently across the floor, I sit by the window and feel an unfamiliar sensation settle into my chest. Peace. Not happiness exactly, life is far too complicated for that word, but peace in the sense that nothing inside me is running anymore. No hiding. No rehearsing explanations, no bracing for discovery. The past still exists, but it no longer owns me. It sits where it belongs, behind me, finally unable to reach forward and rewrite what little time I have left. I think often about how many years I believed my silence was strength. How many women were taught the same lie. How many lives were folded smaller and smaller until they fit neatly into someone else's comfort. If I had known then what I know now, I might have spoken sooner. Or maybe I wouldn't have. Survival teaches you strange lessons, and courage rarely arrives before it's needed. But I also know this: speaking late is not the same as never speaking at all. I am old now. My hands ache, my steps are slow. But when I look at my daughter, my real daughter, my found daughter, I do not see loss anymore. I see continuation. I see proof that truth, once spoken, does not destroy. It repairs. And on the days when guilt tries to creep back in wearing its old familiar face, I remind myself of the final, hardest truth of all: I did not ruin my life. Someone tried to use my silence to erase me. Someone tried to turn my endurance into a sentence. But I am still here. I lived. I loved in the ways I knew how. I told the truth when I was finally able. And that is not a story of shame. That is a story of survival.